Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor Northwood Christian Church, hence the name Northwood Podcast. My church is in Indianapolis, Indiana. And if you're listening but you haven't met us yet, it would be good to meet you. If this sounds like something you'd like to do, I encourage you to please reach out. My email is a good way to do that. It's heath@indncc.org. That's heath@indncc.org. If you're a first-time listener, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel or this podcast on whatever app that you use to listen if you like what you hear today. This way, you'll be notified when new episodes are released. You won't miss one. And also, it will promote us some more by spreading the word. The internet's algorithms work in our favor, I am told, the more people like and subscribe and even comment on our videos. Also, if you can think of anyone who might benefit from this podcast, please share it. This is just one simple way that you can spread a little good news in the world. And we trust that the right ears will find us. Before we move on, I want to thank the All Indiana Podcast Network and Wish TV for producing this podcast and distributing it. I am very grateful for them, and I think that you should visit their webpage to peruse their catalog of podcasts, all made, recorded, and produced in Indiana. So if you're looking for something new to listen to, you might look there first. Simply go to www.wishtv.com/podcasts, or you can type in www.allindianapodcastnetwork.com. You can find it both ways. And here in a moment, we're going to be considering a short passage found in the Gospel of Matthew. But before we move on, I should say that I'm here in my church on a weekday, and we're having summer camp. One of the schools is having a summer camp, and they're outside playing water games and bouncing the basketball and screaming their heads off. So you will hear some of that noise while we are going forward, and I hope it's not too distracting. I just wanted to mention it just in case you hear something going on in the background. Before we move on, we're going to take a break for our listening audience. Those who are listening will experience some ads in this pause. But for those of you who are watching, just bear with us. We're going to take a momentary break for some ads now. And we're back. And our scripture passage that we will be considering today is found in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, and we will be going over verses 14 through 17. That's Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 through 17, and it goes. Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "The wedding attendants cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak, for the patch pulls away from the cloak, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins, otherwise the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are ruined. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." Two parables told there, one about coats, one about wineskins, and that first about patching an old coat with a new patch reminded me of my favorite coat. I don't know if you've ever had a favorite coat or some other form of clothing that you treasured, maybe a favorite shirt, pair of pants, and maybe when you first put it on, it fit just right, and it came to be your regular all-time jacket. And I'll go with jacket moving forward because that's what I'm thinking about here, but you can think about whatever your favorite thing is. It might be your favorite because of the memories attached to it, or maybe it's just comfortable, as I was saying. Either way, I've got this jacket that I've worn for about 10 years now. I think I've had it since before my children were born, and it's fallen apart at the seams. I still wear it, but it's fallen apart. And sometimes when I wear it, I imagine that no one will notice the hole that is formed in the seam under my arm. I've sewed it a few times, it keeps tearing. Or maybe if I tuck in the sleeves, no one will notice that they are so worn that at the ends of the sleeves I have holes for my thumbs. Thumb holes have formed. Once, a couple of years ago, more to the point of today's parable, I did exactly what was suggested there. I went to Meijer or Walmart, I forget which, And a couple of years ago, tell you how long this has been going on, a couple of years ago, I saw where you could buy some patches, some tough canvas-like patches that I think could be ironed on. So I tried it. It was not successful. The material the patches were made of did not conform well to the material of my jacket, and it's so far gone. It is currently so far gone, I don't think there's much that could be done for it. So I can remember watching the patch, disappointedly watching the patch detach from the coat at the elbow the first time I bent my arm. So the parable is true. You can't sew a new patch on an old coat and expect that the coat will be all that it ever was. You may have heard that we've been having discussions at Northwood, at our church, about the changes in our culture and the church's inability, the church is broadly speaking, not just our church, the church is broadly speaking, inability or unwillingness to adapt to changing times and trends. And so we've invited a guest, Dr. Richard Ham, to our church to walk us through the history up until this present moment. And if you've been a part of those talks, you know that the picture he paints is bleak. The church in decline, decade by decade. And I won't bore you with those statistics now, but basically what you've got to know, probably already know, is that in the 1950s, church attendance rose to levels never before seen in our country, even since its conception. In that time, up over 70% of people affiliated with a church in the 1950s. But now, that number is down to around 30% and dipping lower still. And affiliation with churches has been so loosely defined that this may include people who seldom darken the door of a church. These two parables Jesus tells of the old coat and the new patch and the new wineskin, the new wine in the wineskins, bear special relevance for us today, as much as they did in the time of Jesus. And I think that they speak to this question about the decline of the church in North America as well. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. More on that in a moment. You may have noticed, notice what prompted Jesus to tell these parables about coats and wineskins. It's a question about fasting of all things. And what the disciples of John the Baptist want to know is, Jesus, why don't your disciples fast? Just drawing from what I discerned from what I read in the passage, it seems that everyone else participating in this discussion fasted as a part of their religious practice. That is, they refrained from eating food for a period of time to bring them closer to God. How fasting is supposed to do this, bring you closer to God, may depend on the season of life you are in. And people fasted for a variety of reasons in the biblical world. Why you would do this and how you expected it to bring you closer to God vary depending on your circumstance. And so for more on this specifically, I'll just quote from a biblical scholar and preacher named Barbara Reed. Of fasting specifically, she writes, "The Jewish practice of fasting is long-standing. However, the only day on which fasting is required of all is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This tradition likely dates back to pre-exilic times." And just as an aside, that's more than 600 years before Jesus. So 600 years before the passage that we're reading, or the account of the passage we're reading. Back to the quote. Other examples of fasting in the Hebrew scriptures are individuals who fast so as to make their prayer and supplication more efficacious, or those who do so as an expression of penance or mourning. In Daniel 10, chapter 3, 10, verse 3, the later apocalyptic literature, fasting is practiced to make one open to divine revelation or visions. So a variety of purposes, fasting, make you open to divine revelation or visions, to make your prayer more urgent, your petition more urgent to God. Variety of reasons. So to put a fine in on a point, fasting was commonplace in the communities near and around Jesus and had been for a long time. So the question from Jesus' cousin John is not out of left field. John, Jesus' cousin, was no exception. His community fasted too. And the community John was possibly affiliated with, at least biblical scholarship points in that direction, a group called the Essenes, well, we know that they incorporated fasting into their regular practice, as is evidenced in today's story. And, the thing is, in today's story, Jesus even mentions that they will fast someday. In 2 chapters back in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus indicates that he expects his disciples to fast, at least eventually. But apparently they aren't fasting here. And why is this a problem to those questioning Jesus over this issue? Well, more on that in a moment. But first, I should point out that Jesus led his disciples to not only break this precedent, but many other precedents as well. Their refraining from fasting is just one of many other traditions that they challenged or poked at. They ate with persons, for example, determined to be unclean by the traditions. They broke with centuries-old rules pertaining to the Sabbath, choosing to work, in other words, doing work that fed the hungry, instead of the ritualistically prescribed rest. Women within their group were elevated and given more of a voice than the age-old traditions allowed. So now they're refraining from fasting, this time-tested tradition, but it's just the most recent thing. And why are they doing this? Well, Jesus gives the answer right there. He says, in my own words, using my own words to paraphrase him, basically fasting is for the seasons of life which are less than ideal. It's for those days of atonement when one reckons for and accounts for one's sins. Or it is for those moments when you are praying fervently, when the fasting can seem like a hunger strike meant to compel God to notice. Fasting is for times of sorrow, moments before apocalyptic events, as we were reading earlier in that quote from Barbara Reed. So that's when you fast. Jesus tells them that's when you do it. In other words, you don't fast when life is like it is. And he used a wedding as an example. You don't fast when you are a part of the wedding party at a wedding, especially if the person of honor is right there with you, the one you are celebrating. That is the time for feasting, for celebration, and to be glad. And Jesus tells John's disciples at their question about his fasting, that for his disciples, this was such a time. That he, Jesus, was with them, and because of this, so was the realm of God and all that came with it. Jesus brought with him the peace and the power of God, the love of God. So why should they fast? Even if it breaks tradition, times have changed, at least for a moment. And Jesus knows that a time will come for his disciples when fasting will again be appropriate, an appropriate response to the world, but that time is not now. Times had changed. Which indicates that as times change, so should our religious practices to better suit the needs of the people in a specific time and place. Sometimes a practice is perfectly suited to the times. Sometimes that tradition, practice, ritual, way of doing things serves a community very well until it doesn't. And the church has often been very good at holding on to cherished traditions, but has struggled to adapt and change to remain relevant to our communities. And this has been true for a long time. And I'll provide a few examples. It used to be, this is after Jesus' time, but a long time back, about 1,000 years back, used to be that worship was done only in Greek and in Latin, depending on where you were in the world. Inside much of the Christian world, this was basically the case. The difference in Egypt and some other places, but Greek and Latin tended to be the language you'd hear in church. And it wasn't until recent centuries that this changed, and that people began to hear for the first time, some of them, scriptures read and songs sung in their own languages. It was thought that if you changed the language, the tradition of which language to use, you'd somehow lose what matters in translation, or you'd water down the power of this spiritual medicine. But when the Christian reformers of the 16th century began to conduct church services in common languages, many people were made uncomfortable by this, to say the least. I mean, it's just human nature to feel uncomfortable at change, especially if what we're changing is centuries old, or in this case, more than 1,000 years old. Another story, the story of the introduction of instruments into church life, is another case in point. Many Christians in the first centuries thought that using instruments in church to aid in worship was a bad thing, even a sin. It wasn't until the 15th century that the pipe organ, of all things, the pipe organ, which is now thought of as very traditional and very old, well, it was brand new in the 15th century. It became widely used in churches. It wasn't until the Reformations in the 16th century, though, that a wider array of instruments were eventually accepted. At that time, it was just the pipe organ. Again, tradition, keeping things stuck. The story about the introduction of the piano, to name another instrument, into Christian music may seem quite comical from today's perspective, but it's true to human nature. The piano wasn't widely used in churches until the 1800s, so quite recent, because pianos were associated with bars and drinking songs. So to think of bringing such an instrument that helps aid and abet the revelry in the corner pub into your church, unthinkable. But it was the music that the common people understood, and the songs were the songs that the people understood, sung in a language that they in fact spoke. So some of the revivalists in the 19th century, the 1800s, brought pianos into their churches, and they began to sing Christian lyrics, some to the melodies of the popular songs of their day. It is from the vantage point of history that we see these developments as progress. Bringing the organ in, new instruments, using your own language in church. I mean, I'm guessing if you're listening to this, expect to hear a language you understand in church. Probably. You expect to hear music in church, hopefully music that the public broadly likes, maybe even that you like. But this was not always the case, and the backlash in those moments in history was fierce in some circles, and some Christian communities wholly rejected these changes that nearly all of us now think of as progress. And for some, these changes felt like the end of their world. When Jesus was telling these parables about the wineskins and the old coats, he was trying to usher in an even bigger change than these examples that I've just mentioned about music and language. I mean, do you think that bringing new music and new instruments into a church is contentious? Try doing what Jesus was doing. Try bringing in new kinds of people, especially if the people under discussion are viewed with suspicion. And usually people who are different than us are viewed with suspicion. For Jesus, one of the things that this new wine he's talking about here symbolized was the inclusion of the other people groups into his faith community. Tax collectors and sinners, there's a start, the morally flawed and the outright wicked. Invite them to your table in hopes to reconcile, in hopes that they will have a change of heart. Or take Samaritans, who represented in Jesus' day and time and place a different religious tradition than his. Jesus involves them in some of his parables as the good guys. Imagine it, someone from a different religious tradition framed as a hero. And Jesus meets with a Samaritan woman and drinks from her cup, which was never done. So he's breaking all of these boundaries set around categories of who is dirty, unclean, unworthy. And Jesus says in so many words, and by his actions, these words, my paraphrase, open up your lives and include them. They are also a part of God's family. And this perspective was part of the newness, the new wine that Jesus acknowledged was flowing in the world in his time. The new patch that will hopefully find a coat. If only there were communities that could hold this life within them, that can sustain this change, foster it, and be blessed by it without being torn apart. But Jesus knows what happens when a community is not ready to receive even new wine. New wine is wine that is still fermenting. Literally, the new wine, if you're talking about the drink, is wine that's still fermenting. And new wine releases gases which will expand and stretch whatever container that holds it. In Jesus' day, these containers were bags made out of animal hide. And the wineskin had better be flexible enough and supple enough to stretch and strain as the new wine turns into the finished product. As it ferments and swells and gases are made, the wineskin swells and stretches. And if the wineskin is not flexible or supple in this way, it will burst at the seams and the wine will be wasted. The new life that is there, wasted. Jesus is making the point that God's people need to be as flexible, ready to adjust as the times require. Because there is new wine in the world always. God is doing a new thing again and again all over the place. And the question for Christians in North America is, will we welcome the newness God brings into our churches? God is good, and the Spirit moves where it will. We don't want to miss it. We want to be a part. I hope. I believe. And times are a-changing. Did you notice? Everyone notices. We can't avoid it. But God is still in the mix, calling us to newer and fuller life. And there have been times when the church has embraced the new wine and has served as a suitable vessel to hold the messy, uncomfortable fermentation process of this change. I'm thinking here of some, emphasis on some, churches' involvement in the abolition movements of the 18th and 19th and even into the 20th centuries. I'm thinking of labor movements of the 19th century and the early 20th century, which more or less ended legalized child labor in our country, as well as brought about time off and fair pay for laborers. You may not have known this, but this effort was organized and driven by many pastors and religious leaders across the country, along with other persons of goodwill. Now there's wine for you, new wine, with the church in some places and in that time ready to hold it through the process, in the discomfort, in the straining stress of the change. Also, there's the women's suffrage movement, which many supported within the church, supported by many pastors and theologians as the new movement of God in our land. I'm also thinking here of the civil rights movements of the 20th century. And some churches rejected these new movements in our country. This new wine poured into some old, worn-out churches that wished to cling to their past, which for many involved overt segregation, racism. And in the end, the church in some places defended these desires by warped Christian theologies. There's new wine into old wineskins, which leads me to more modern movements. Women's rights are still fragile and lacking in many regards. And then there's the issue that dominates the focus of some, gay rights and the inclusion of queer people in society and in every level of the church. Some have viewed this as new wine and a new movement of God's Spirit in the church. Others, not so much. And I am very much on the new wine side, believing that just as Jesus widened the circle to include marginalized and hated groups, this is our moment to do the same. Here is yet another moment where the body of Christ can model this love again for the world to see. This is the season and time we are in part. This is part of what it includes. But the work has always been hard and contentious. This has been hard and contentious. 2,000 years ago, Rome was threatened by Jesus, as were the religious authorities of his day. And in a similar way, the powers and authorities around us have been threatened by these movements towards more equitable, just, and diverse communities. But this is where I believe the Spirit is leading us. After all, has this not been the vision of the church from the beginning? A united humanity, reconciled to one another and to God, living in peace. And this is where God wants to take us. This is the new wine God is wanting us to receive. Just read the end of the book. But is the church a fit receptacle for this change? Just think in Jesus' day, they couldn't cope with the idea that they might not fast for a season. Even change like that, they couldn't take. You know how we are. Can we hold the new wine without bursting? And for some churches, the answer has been a resounding no. They split, they divide, or they double down, resisting these changes. But for others, they have held the tension and have learned to make it through this discomfort. It's like introducing a new style of music. It'll take some time to get used to, but we're not talking about music here. We're talking about people, God's children, and their place in the church. So the stakes are high. This is a question of life or death for many ostracized persons in need of belonging. Literally, this is a question of life or death for some, their inclusion into society. How about the church? It now occurs to me that perhaps this is another reason Jesus chose this illustration for us, because even the process of fermentation can be viewed as a very uncomfortable process for the wineskins to endure. The wineskins swell up full to bursting. The seams are stretched. Gases escape, burping out the top of the container. And the whole process is kind of dirty, kind of uncouth, uncivilized. It at least illustrates for us that communities that try to hold the new wine may well be strained near capacity. This work may well stretch us to the limits. You know, I still have my old coat. I haven't thrown it out yet, and I don't want to. I'm hoping my old coat can withstand what comes next along with me. But I realize that in life I'm going to have to learn to leave some things behind. Many precious things we keep, but learning to let go of what we must is a part of growing up and learning to be wise. Imagine how it would be if we church folk could leave what does not serve us well behind, including our fear of others. How if the church was creating the new music in our culture instead of rehashing and repeating what we hear around us? How if we produced the provocative art that taught the gospel while inspiring the world? It used to be this way. Go to Europe and see the cathedrals erected when the church was on the cutting edge of the arts and education. There was a time. Even science was not at first seen as something antagonistic to faith, and it should not still today. I already mentioned some of the social movements I can identify as new wine for a new age. Leaving behind prejudice and discrimination should be easy for Christians because it is what our faith calls us to as a foundational value and principle. We could be, should have always been, on the forefront leading edge of the charge for these righteous causes. And some Christians, to their credit, some saints now past have. Some saints with us are doing this still, but many others have not. And you may be listening just thinking, boy, you sure have a different idea about what new wine is and isn't, Pastor. Chances are it was me naming the inclusion of LGBTQ persons as a new movement of God's Spirit that triggered you. Could be. That's often what offends people in most churches. And if this describes you, please consider. Perhaps your growing edge here is to open yourself up to these movements toward a fuller inclusion. After all, if you are listening to this and are a Christian and a Gentile, then there was a time when you were the new wine here talked about. Jesus advocated for a place for you here in the church when there wasn't one. And this was a new thing and very difficult for his community to accept. There was a time and a place when you would have likely have been thought of as unclean by virtue of your birth and social standing, but some other Christians were flexible enough to hold you, even through their discomfort at your embrace. Over time, they came to see the likes of you as their kin, as their family. That is, Jesus made a way for early Jewish Jesus followers to include Gentiles into their in group. And in all likelihood, that means you. And it means me for sure. But for many of us, it seems we'd still rather cling to our old, wore-down coats, figuratively speaking. I hope that this isn't true, but sometimes it seems that there's not a patch made strong enough or big enough to patch us all up. But God hasn't given up on us yet. Nonetheless, churches will divide and close down to keep out the new wine. And in so doing, the church in North America may well seal its fate. For you see, new wine also symbolizes new life. This is true in the Hebrew Bible, and up until the time of Jesus, it's what it comes to symbolize as metaphor. And if a church is not replenished by new movements, new life, movements of God's Spirit, calling us to a fuller life, then it will die. The old coat cast aside, the new wine spilt out all over the ground, and what a waste. What a missed opportunity. And many churches are squandering this moment by refusing to accept the winds of change, these movements of God's Spirit. So let's not miss this moment in history. It is not too late for you and for me. Let's not allow one drop of God's new life to be spilt or wasted. I hope that my church is ready to receive what new life God has for us. New wine for new wineskins. Could it be that we are ready? I hope with my whole heart that we are.